Okay, so welcome everyone. This is the session on revitalization of Indigenous and African food cultures. My name is Andrew Bennie and I'll be moderating the session. Just as a short introduction, I'm a researcher at the African Center for Biodiversity, which is based in Johannesburg, where we work on issues of biodiversity in African food systems, biosafety, corporate power in African food systems, and seed sovereignty. So in this session, we'll be examining the question of revitalizing Indigenous and African food cultures in a context where there's been a steady shift from traditional and indigenous production and eating patterns to so-called modern patterns. So in this discussion, we'll be reflecting on a reawakening on agroecological production, consumption, and marketing of Indigenous and African foods. And to lead us in this discussion, we're lucky to be joined by Bibi Giyose, who's speaking to us from Botswana, as I understand, and Professor Cecilia Onyango, who is in Kenya. So to give an introduction to our two speakers, Bibi Giyose is the Senior Nutrition and Food Systems Officer and Special Advisor to the NEPAD CEO. Previously, she advised the New Partnership for Africa's Development Planning and Coordination Agency, an organ of the African Union on the same, and was a UNDP UNAIDS Regional Project Coordinator for HIV and Nutrition. Bibi holds a Master's of Science in International Nutrition from Cornell University in Ithaca in the United States, and a Bachelor's of Science in Nutrition and Dietetics from Appalachian State University, also in the United States. Thank you for being with us, Bibi.
Thank you very much, Andrew. It is a real pleasure.
Great.
Should I proceed?
Let me just introduce Cecilia. So I'll do the introduction at the beginning and then we can have a nice smooth presentation from you to Cecilia after that. So Professor Cecilia Onyango is an Associate Professor of Horticulture at the University of Nairobi in Kenya. She has over 18 years of experience in training, research, and community outreach in the areas of crop production systems, post-harvest handling, standards, and food safety. The main focus of her research work has been on sustainable African traditional crops production and utilization. Cecilia also distinguishes herself as a scholar who embraces a systems thinking approach to create sustainable food systems for food security and nutrition. Thank you, Professor Onyango, for being with us.
Thanks, Andrew, and I'm grateful to be in this space. Thanks.
Great. So just to let you know, Bibi and Cecilia will each present for 10 minutes, and then afterwards we'll have 20 minutes for open discussion. So please do feel free to our audience, please do feel free to engage. Just also to note, I think as you've seen in the previous format, you will be able to also speak verbally, not only in the chat. But please do also pose your points during the presentations. Please also do pose your points and questions in the chat box. After the presentations, you can ask questions, but please also feel free to also just share your own experiences related to traditional and indigenous foods and key ideas that you feel we should be taking forward in our efforts to revitalize indigenous and African food patterns. And when we do that discussion session, if you wish to speak, please raise your hand and I'll select you in the order that people appear. And then also please just keep your questions and comments brief so that we do have as much time as possible for people to engage. Okay, so over to our speakers, and please just a reminder to speak relatively slowly, like I'm trying to do now. I tend to speak fast for our interpreters. Okay, so over to you, Bibi, who you'll be speaking on policy considerations for action around indigenous foods.
Thank you very much once again, Andrew, for the kind introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a pleasure for me to be here. Before I start my presentation, let me just clarify that I'm actually speaking from Johannesburg and not from Botswana, although I'm from Botswana. And then secondly, that I am actually wearing two hats, one of FAO as a secondee now to the African Union Development Agency, formerly known as NEPAD. So let me try to share my screen. Once again, thank you, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, and old friends from the world of nutrition, food systems, and indigenous considerations. So let me start by just highlighting the importance of indigenous, traditional, and neglected species. I think more often than not, when we think about the spaces that we occupy from this particular subject, we tend to imagine that talking about traditional, indigenous, and neglected means that we're talking about something that is so simple and oversimplified, really. But that should not be the case, because we know that our modern food systems, as they say, are broken. So they need a lot of fixing. What do we mean by this? Over the time, more and more people are eating from a less diversified set of products, which means that our food systems are not actually geared towards improving nutrition and health. So how can we make sure that we revisit the whole notion of around policy of focusing in terms of agriculture on the production, on the markets and economic gain, without really putting nutrition at the heart and the center of why these systems exist? And moreover, our current food systems are not inclusive. The poorest and the most vulnerable and marginalized do not actually have any much voice or agency in their options to choose what they would really like to put on the table. So then what is the role of indigenous foods and other systems in terms of knowledge, especially to tackle what we now know as the triple burden of malnutrition? You see, when you look at and consider the fact that our forefathers or forebearers, they seem to have something really good to transmit unto generations going forward. Back in the days, not to glorify certain systems because they may have not been perfect, but they served a very essential purpose of livelihoods, of cultural inheritance, of transmitting the knowledge systems and ensuring that people are actually not just fed, but nourished, to minimize the undernourishment, to minimize the macronutrient deficiencies, as we know that nowadays, our diets are much more starch-based, carbohydrate-based, without providing the requisite nutrition for those that need it. And we can get that nutrition from our traditional foods and indigenous species. And the nutrition transition has actually had a negative consequence on the consumers because, like I said, consumers don't have as much agency as they used to. This means they are forced into food environments that do not allow them to make the right nutritional and healthy choices. So what does this mean in terms of...
Please, no audio, please.
Okay, technical, they say there's no audio. Okay, while they fix that, let me just get on to my next slide to
There's
say...
no audio.
We can hear you fine.
Okay, okay. We have a shrinking diversity, like I just mentioned, and consumption patterns. FAO estimates that there are over 7,000 crop species globally, but unfortunately, we have been reduced to, at the most, 4 global staples, which means, started to say, over the 7,000 crop species globally, we've been restricted to only about 12, and the bulk of which is actually around 4 staples, namely wheat, rice, maize, and potatoes, making up 60% of our global consumption. Why is this? What about the other 6, 9, 8, 8 species that we should be exploring and indeed exploiting? Where are our sorghums, the millets, the fonio, the teff, and what about our edible wild species, whether they are plant, animal, or aquatic? I think for me, this poses a very interesting question in the sense that as you look at, now my screen is stuck. Okay, let's see. Okay, I'm trying to reshare my screen. Tech team from that side, may you assist? Okay, let's see if I can't seem to be able to move the cursor. So tech team, if you may move to my next slide, that side.
If you look at the bottom left of the screen, there are arrows, left-right arrows in the bottom left-hand corner.
Bottom left. Yep, I am on there, but I don't seem to be.
Further over, further left.
Okay, this way?
Yes.
Okay,
There.
okay. Then I can do that easily. Okay, thank you so much. I'm technologically challenged. I'm from the old school side. So the reality we are facing nowadays is that, we have a collapse in our policy outlook, especially when you look at the consumer needs. I mean, we have a tendency of modern consumers to imagine that local species, they are obviously not as revered as they should be. They are viewed as, for the poor people. And so in this instance, there has been a clear policy misguidance and incoherence across all the sectors that should be coordinating to say, what do people need to eat? How do we improve our value chains and make sure that all the necessary species are actually taken into consideration? And then, of course, with all the technology around us, advertising, marketing, there is a shift, and an, skewed movement towards only promoting those commodities and foods that are viewed as modern and therefore fashionable, and therefore if you consume them, you are seen as having arrived. And I think one of the challenges in terms of the policy and research space is, that of adequate nutrient content analysis, so that we can better understand what is contained in these foods and how we as professionals can be promoting. And people are not educated enough around, understanding that, the quality is great. These foods can be available or are available, and they can be affordable, and they are indeed culturally acceptable. So national policies have actually continually, failed to place the consumer at the center. Who is placed at the center? It is the trader. It is the value chain person. It is the supermarket. It is all the other agents that actually may not have necessarily the interest of the consumer at heart. Now, let me just, give you two quick examples. I mean, I could have a plethora of examples, but I would just like to restrict myself to two really interesting examples in terms of how did these two countries manage to restore some of their cultural heritage in terms of their products. The case of Botswana sorghum story, back in the 80s, after the famous drought, Botswana decided, as a matter of policy and action, to say we are going to be researching more, collaborating around research for sorghum, because sorghum is our national staple. We produced a winning food that are sorghum-based called tsabana, literally meaning 4 children under 5 who are malnourished. So then the government decided, again from a policy and investment perspective, to say, let us look at, our millers. So started with 1 milling company that put the sorghum on the supermarket shelf. I'm happy to say that post-2020, we have over 300 sorghum millers supplying a range of brands. Now, in terms of Kenya, I just love what Kenya has done with this research around African green leafy vegetables. Now we have mchicha, we have sukuma wiki, we have others on the market because they recognize the value of their indigenous and traditional African leafy vegetables and said, you know what, this is what is providing the nutrition, the much needed vitamins and minerals to the bulk of the population. They did that, and today Kenya has been able to not only just put the foods on the market, those leafy vegetables, but also to just get the people to be proud of what they're consuming. So here lies the opportunity. And this is an opportunity that I would be remiss if I don't refer to what COVID has shown us. What COVID has shown us is that there are cracks in many systems, let alone the food systems itself, let alone the policies themselves, and let alone the actions across the intersectionality of nutrition, as you know that nutrition is not the purview of any one subject. So COVID has actually taught us to go back to basics, has taught us to be more resilient, has taught us to really say we can do our back garden, we can, use our own traditional and indigenous species. So it's a cyclical approach, looking at the economic side, livelihoods, nutrition, health, and productivity. But let me just conclude by saying, really we have to rethink and reposition nutrition through the neglected species in better light. COVID has given us that opportunity. We should really exploit and make sure that we optimize it. I think we still need more research around the various species, across the board. And literally, we need to have a consumer-based and focused nutrition education. If the consumer does not know what they should be eating, the consumer-driven perspective or mentality cannot ensue. And what we lack in Africa, as I've noticed, is, lack of standards, regulatory mechanism, and the protection and intellectual property of our own species. And of course, we need to champion and enhance advocacy around this. What are the cultural heritages we should be promoting and protecting? And building strong consumer movements. I mean, in Latin America, it is interesting that it is the consumer movements that have actually driven policy towards a better placement of what needs to be consumed that is more nutritious, healthy, and therefore better movements going forward. And engaging the youth, these guys are those who are in the tech space. How do we get them to use social media to promote, these cultural and indigenous foods? And last but not least, Africa needs to really work on its food-based dietary guidelines. Out of Africa, I think there's only 3, if not 4 countries that have these. These are important as an entry point for not just policy, but also program design, program delivery, monitoring, and evaluation, so that we get the right impact, communicate the right impact, and now be really proud of African and everything. I really like to thank you so much. I think this was it. Thank you very much. Over to you, Andrew.
Wonderful. Thanks, Bibi. You were really good and disciplined timekeeper. That was brilliant timing. So thanks a lot for us to think about, especially the issues around linking to the question of, what you pointed to at the beginning with despite the loss of biodiversity, the amount of biodiversity and food crops that actually still is there on the African continent, and really the need to look at what we do have and really elevate that in terms of meeting nutritional needs. So one of the things you also mentioned there at the end is the research that we still need and the role of researchers in elevating indigenous food crops, which is exactly what Cecilia does. So that's a good way into then turning to Cecilia.
Thank you very much and welcome everyone to this discussion this afternoon, where we are talking about giving the energy, giving a new life to indigenous and African food cultures. And my discussion will be around that aspect of how can we give the indigenous and African food cultures a new life, a new figure. This presentation, we prepared it with my colleague, Dr. Mokaya Peter from the Organic Consumers Alliance. This was for backup. In case I'll not make it, then it was going to be available to still engage everyone in this discussion. And to start us off, now we have COVID-19 and what we have seen happening. And I think Bibi has mentioned these borders have been restricted. There is restriction in movement, there are lockdowns. However, in all this, we must continue eating. And this has been brought out clearly in our last book, the latest version of the Barefoot Guide that we did on the role of food and how to manage COVID-19. The link can be shared for those interested. And what we have seen that for all the countries, the food systems were greatly affected. And therefore, what we realized is that for those who had their own foods, who were not dependent on others to produce for them, to supply to them, they are the ones who survived the situation that we are now having. So food sovereignty has become very important, and this has been brought out by this COVID-19 pandemic. And therefore, now we are talking about giving this vigor, this new life to our African food cultures. And we know that the culture of our people really is made up of the values, the attitudes, the habits and customs. And these start right at childhood and they get strongly internalized. It influences the belief systems, the lifestyle, and the diet. And that's why some of us, especially in Kenya, will be referring to my grandmother's vegetable because of the way it was made and even the type, which maybe I'm not able to do now in the city. So indigenous foods in Africa, they are really prominent cultural signifiers for the various ethnic groups. And you might be surprised, or this could be known to most of us, that in the African setup, people really never talked about food in matters nutritional value. They will talk about good health, but not the nutritional content. They'll talk about the social meaning, the ceremonial meaning, and what that food symbolized. And that's very important. Even when we want to achieve nutrition outcomes from the foods that we are using, these social ceremonial meanings and symbolisms actually had an effect on the nutrition outcomes of communities. And as you realize that food cultures are quite dynamic and hence they're constantly changing. And now we are seeing modern cultures, which is an ongoing process. And this sometimes leads to dietary changes. And because we are we are taking up modern cultures of foods, we are seeing the production and utilization of indigenous foods really going down. And we are now specializing, as Bibi has told us, on just a few of those foods. If you went to a tradition or to an African market, what you see is a lot of diversity. But that's only those who go to those markets. What about the majority who are not in environments that are supplied directly from farms? What are they doing? They're going into supermarkets, accessing processed foods, and that are of limited diversity, both in terms of type of the foods and also the nutrients they're in. So what are the reasons for the decline of indigenous food cultures in Africa? What we are saying is that there's a continuous sidelining by the modern food cultures. That's the modern foods, the introduced foods, because they are thought to be superior and more socially acceptable. We have lost the knowledge on the nutritional and social value, and this has greatly affected the production, the preparation, and consumption of our traditional and indigenous foods. Look at the modern or the school curriculum, for example, right from the very low levels, the kindergartens, and all the way to into colleges or higher institutions of learning. They tend to give priority to the introduced foods. And in the production and consumption, emphasis is given on these introduced foods. And if any, very limited focus is given to the indigenous foods or food systems for that matter. These curricula that are modern, focusing on modern crops, they have just picked a few of those crops at the expense of the numerous diverse indigenous crops. And therefore, there's this call now that we have to go back. We must give the life that these indigenous systems and food cultures deserve. So the main consequences of losing this indigenous food culture is that there's now a domineering influence of the Western food culture and food systems. Communities have lost their food sovereignty. That's the right to determine their own food system. Because if you look at governments, most of the times, they're focusing on those introduced crops. And therefore, the communities are at the mercy of, for example, the availability of seed of those crops. And the communities have been made not to save their own seed of the introduced crops, because you must provide a market for the people selling the seed. And we have lost big time. We have moved from self-reliance to dependence on the industrial agrochemical food chains, and this has greatly impacted the food security and nutrition of the masses. If you go to any markets, especially in Kenya now, most of the seeds for indigenous foods are not readily available. No one is producing them. And that which is produced, maybe people are just trying them out. They can't give us the quality seed that our grandparents used to save and use for the next crop season. And if you look at it, even now that Kenya has greatly promoted the production and consumption of the indigenous vegetables, for example, because those are the ones that have been greatly promoted and supported by government. The thing is, the way they are produced is following the production practices of the introduced crops. And to tell you frankly, from the research we are doing, these indigenous or traditional crops, which form the indigenous food cultures, they behave totally differently when you give them this kind of inputs, the agrochemicals. So instead of these crops delivering the quality, the nutrients that they're meant to deliver, because for sure they're very rich from the initial analysis that were done, now that they are being produced using the agrochemicals, the contents in them have totally changed. In fact, most of them start accumulating anti-nutrients, and this is a case which we have evidence of the traditional leafy vegetables. So we lose the benefit of these foods that were so rich for nutrition and health to now turning them to be sources of unsafe foods, because we have not developed production practices that maintain the quality that they're supposed to have. So what's the way forward then?
If you could wrap up in the next 30 seconds or so.
Yes, I'll do that. So we need to reawaken the agroecological production, consumption, and marketing. And governments must shift policies towards ecological food production that embrace indigenous foods. And efforts should be directed towards seed saving and sharing of these crops. But most importantly, literacy must be on top of that so that we can promote them. If we can promote foods like noodles on billboards, posters, and calendars, we should be able to do this for the indigenous foods. And we can do this through constantly reminding communities about where and what type of food to produce, how it's produced to maintain quality, because we have seen what agrochemicals can do, and how it's distributed, marketed, and prepared while maintaining the quality and safety. So we can do this through integration into curriculum or through informally practicing within communities. We must do research, we must document and disseminate this knowledge so that we can empower communities to ensure future food security and sovereignty. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Cecilia. That was also nice and to the point and according to time. Sorry I had to push you there. Thanks very much, Cecilia and Bibi, both really informative and to the point presentations. I think one of the key things that really stood out from both of your presentations is this question of the consumption side, that we must focus on the production of indigenous crops, but to really support their production, and there's really a big question around increasing their consumption, which relates to people's attitudes, to awareness, to education, and so on. So there's quite a big policy question there, I think, as well. You know, what role for policy in increasing the demand on the consumption side for indigenous crops? So I think we are a bit tight on time, so we'll probably only have enough time for one round of engagements. So Bibi and Cecilia, should we maybe take like 4 or 5 comments and questions at once, and then give you a chance to respond to them? So maybe just to speak to one interesting comment on the consumption question here from Francois Stepman, and then we'll go to see if anyone wants to raise points verbally. On this consumption side, there's a question of how can we overcome the disconnect between the agri-food industry and researchers. So what role is there for researchers to identify opportunities in the African food heritage to then look at processed foods that are still nutritious and so on. So I think the word processed, we don't have to shy away from. Processed doesn't always refer only to non-nutritious, food that actually doesn't resemble food anymore. But how can we think about really nutritious ways of processing food and the role of researchers in that to make it attractive to consumers? So that's quite, I think, an interesting question from the chat there. There's quite a few more in the chat. But should we take any from the floor? Are there any questions or comments or experiences you'd like to share from the floor?
I just have a quick question. This is Daniel Moss from the Agroecology Fund. Thank you for those great presentations. Yeah, just a quick question. If either of you have found any uptake of these kind of indigenous products within the supermarkets. I know that there's increasing interest in the nutritional value and local foods, and I'm just wondering if there's any kind of shelf space, in kind of a niche product way for these and then the second question, I guess, is if that's true, is there availability to be a supplier in such a way that it's not exploitative to the small producer? In other words, taken up by some, other more well-financed intermediary.
Thanks very much, Daniel. Are there any other inputs from the floor?
Yes, I have a question.
Please go for it, David.
Yes, thank you. So maybe I want to know what is the space, who's the research? Because when we're talking about research, whose research are we talking about? Because from the presentations, I agree with the two speakers, but they seem to ignore that the farms are big laboratories and farmers actually carry out research every day. So it's very important for us to understand that when we talk about research, who's the research we're talking about? Is it the farmer-led research in the farm or the research led in laboratories away from the farms?
Thanks very much, David. There's also another interesting comment here in the chat, which essentially relates to saying that there's also the problem with reviving indigenous foods, that seed laws and so on. There's also a problem of farmers' rights and farmers' control over their seed that they need in order to produce this indigenous food. So maybe there's a question for us, for our speakers, to think about what is the key policy intervention or interventions needed on the consumption side, but also how do we think about ensuring that the production side is supported and that farmers aren't restricted in producing these indigenous crops? Okay, let's take another couple of questions. Roger, your hand is up.
I have a question. I don't see where to put my hand up.
Okay, can we start with Roger and then we'll go to you. Sorry, what's your name?
Kevin.
Kevin. Okay, let's start with Roger and then to you, Kevin. Roger, please go for it. Okay, it seems Roger's no longer with us. Do you want to go, Kevin? You're on mute, Kevin.
I raised my hand too.
Okay, do you hear me now?
Yes, please go, Kevin, and then we'll come to you, Mabel. You're on mute again, Kevin. Please unmute yourself.
Hello?
Now you're fine. Continue.
Yes, I would like to thank the two ladies for the good presentation. And I would like to situate my intervention on the development framework that Africa has chosen. Africa has chosen a liberalized environment. That means anyone will come into your market space and basically try to sell. And that's what the owners of those value chains of the modern food we are talking about are doing. So if they are advertising, if they are packaging, if they are doing all those things, then it would be, the imperative is on African countries themselves to invest in re-educating the people about the value of their own food and also invest in the sort of value addition that meets the needs of today. I worked in one program where we used the cassava in Benin and introduced a portion of it to the wheat flour to produce baguette. That's what people want to carry in their bags when they're going to school. So then you should repackage your indigenous food in a manner that fits their needs. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Mabel, you were next.
Yes, thank you. My concern is the youth, the upcoming generation are more interested in food items that are ready to eat. So that's why they go for Indomie and all these pastas. They are easy to cook. They don't take time. So how do we go about repackaging our produce and adding value that reduce the time it takes to process them into finished products? If we can do this, I think it will also sell them to the people like this or that one. They will be able to compete favorably with the imported ones. I appreciate the speakers.
Great, thanks very much. Maybe Cecilia, do you want to respond first, and then Bibi?
Okay, thank you, Andrew, and thank you, everyone, for the comments and also for the questions. I think I have a few, maybe if I missed some, Andrew, you could add on. There was a question of whose research are we talking about? And about the seed laws and the value addition and processing and packaging issues with the traditional foods. So I will respond to this, and then I can get others if there are. So at least what we are doing at the universities in Kenya, because we collaborate quite a bit, is to work with communities and get the produce they have of the traditional foods. And this is the analysis we do, and try to look at different production practices and how they influence the quality of products. So we are not working in the labs, we are actually working with communities. I have worked with the now 3 indigenous vegetables. Some are traditional, not quite indigenous. My PhD work was was looking at amaranth and how it behaves with the different production practices and how that affects its nutritional quality and post-harvest handling. Then I have worked with the African nightshade, but also with the spider plant, which is the Cleome gynandra. And all this is with communities, because we want to understand how that plant's system changes when the production environment is changed, and because we want to understand how the use of agrochemicals influence that quality. So we are doing this at the community level with farmers, mostly in Western and Nyanza parts of this country. Then in terms of seed, that's a big challenge for most of these crops, because especially in Kenya, that's where I'm based, I have enough knowledge. The informal seed systems are not well supported by policy. And it's only recently that now people are pushing to have these systems integrated and supported by government, but also by the policies. So we are still very far from ensuring that farmers can actually produce and save quality seed for the next season without depending on the purchase from the markets, and also to bring to the same level the issue of seed system of the indigenous and traditional crops, just like the introduced crops. And yes, the shying away of the consumption of these foods is because most of the youth feel that the process involved for you to get these foods and prepare them for consumption takes too long, or so they don't have that time. So they want to go for the ready to eat or the processed foods. That's a reality. And not much research work is being done, especially in my country, to come up with all these products that are easy to use. But yes, some work is being done, but I think it's not enough. And therefore, we really need to come up with ways that we can package, or process, package, and use these crops. I think that's what I have, Andrew, unless there's something I've forgotten.
That's great. Thanks very much, Cecilia. Bibi, should we turn to you? There was also a question, I don't know if you can engage with this, Bibi. There was also a question about how you as speakers see the role of supermarkets is kind of, if I understood the question correctly, as outlets for indigenous food products. But then also from there, the question of ensuring small-scale farmers aren't exploited in that potential relationship, if I understood the question correctly. Something you may want to touch on. But please, over to you, Bibi.
Thank you very much for the great questions, and the inquisition around it is quite interesting. I think let me start with the consumption role. And really, when we talk about processed foods, we shouldn't shy away from the terminology. I think the most important thing is to look at the trade-offs. What are the trade-offs when you process certain foods certain ways? And how do you make sure that you don't lose the nutritional content of it, and then you are able to make it look attractive, if to use the term, to make it look sexy? You want to make it appealing so that a wider base of consumers are attracted to the food. And then you also want to make sure that really in terms of the processing, educating the producer and the processor, because they have to realize that it is not one or the other. You can process the food, maintain its nutrient content, and really still make money out of it. So for me, good nutrition is the greatest business sense. So now, when you look at let me come to the issue of putting our products on the supermarket shelf. What we have seen in Botswana is actually a very interesting trajectory and exponential growth of not only the consumption and the availability of these foods on the supermarket shelves, but also there has been a shift in the production system where now farmers are more interested in growing various types of sorghum because, one, they know there is a market for it, and two, they're going to be making money out of it. So what a lovely combination around, the win-win-win situation around, these crops and products. Now, on to the question of the African framework, maybe the African framework for promoting, these commodities. You may all know or are aware of the Comprehensive Africa Agricultural Development Program that was conceived in Maputo in 2003. This framework is precisely about ensuring that all the smallholder farmers are engaged, that the African agriculture policy and program is in tandem, is in line with the broader development agenda of the continent. Now, in 2014 in Malabo, this framework was revised with the key importance and message of re-looking at how do we get nutrition at the center of the Malabo Declaration around CAADP. And now also linking that with the global frameworks and
Bibi, you've gone on mute there.
Okay, how does the African agenda link with the Sustainable Development Agenda so that SDG 2 links to all the other SDGs and we're able to harness the knowledge and information that is coming up and should be communicated and really made sure that everyone appreciates it. Let me just take one moment to do some marketing here. October 30th is the Africa Day for Food and Nutrition Security. And interestingly, one of the side events during this year's commemoration on the 29th will be exactly around this subject, traditional and indigenous neglected food species, engaging with the African community and other partners indeed. So I think I just wanted to buttress the point that Cecilia raised. I think one challenge we have in Africa is around, I'm not a specialist in this area, so pardon me, gene banks. I mean, do we have adequate gene banking And do we have access? And do we own it? Or who owns our gene? Our gene our genes and our gene banks, and how a smallholder family farmer can access them. So those would be some of the challenges that I would like to also throw to the audience right here. Thank you very much. Over to you, Andrew.
Thanks very much, Bibi. We are already now 10 minutes over time, which is such a pity. This has been an amazing discussion, and it feels like we've only gotten started. And there's really a host of amazing comments and questions in the chat box here as well that we haven't been able to engage with. So I'm assured that our tech people will be saving all this information in the chat box so that we can record it and use it for further engagement, both in our engagements with the FAO and in terms of the report of this conference, and as key issues as to feed into continuing discussions around policy and markets and nutrition and indigenous food and so on. So thank you so much, Bibi and Cecilia, for your efforts, and to the audience who really engaged wonderfully. So I think some of the key points that really came out of this discussion is that these traditional food crops and bringing back indigenous foods, there's a critical link with nutrition, but also that in order to revalue these crops, we need to link it to nutrition, but also to build rebuild a social value around those crops. There's also the big question around policy supporting the processing of these foods in healthy and nutritious ways, to both add value to producers, but also to add appeal to consumers as well. There's also this question about ensuring that the broader, and there was also a comment in the chat about ensuring that this revival of indigenous food products is linked to a broader development agenda that moves beyond also just liberalization and opening up economies to kind of corporate food producers, especially from Europe and so on, but that this indigenous food policy focus must be part of a kind of holistic and coherent development agenda on the African continent. There's also lastly a very, I think, important input there about also linking this question to support for production of these crops. You raise a really interesting point there, Cecilia, about the fact that in Kenya, we see policy that supports production of indigenous food crops, but it's in the conventional production system, which reduces their nutritional value. So I think there's a very strong point there that indigenous food crops needs to be aligned with agroecological production very closely and clearly as part of maintaining the nutritional value. But also the question of ensuring that in order to ensure that we have the base for this, the production of these nutritious genetic food crops, that we also look at the frameworks for preserving genetic diversity in our food systems. So I think those are some of the key points that have come up in our discussion that are quite important for us to think about moving forward. So just to say thank you again to the speakers and to the audience for your participation here. Also just to remind you that we will work on a short summary report of the session, which will then be submitted to the FAO Secretariat and as part of the report to the workshop proceedings of this conference. So I think this brings us to the end of the first day of the AFSA conference. Luckily, we have still another 2 days to engage, I think, as enthusiastically and interestingly as we have in this session. So thank you very much to everyone who was here, and wishing you a wonderful evening.
Thank you very much, Andrew, and thank you to the participants for engaging so well. Thank you so much.
And thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.